CD3. The Doll's House by Catherine Mansfield. When dear old Mrs. Hay went back to London after staying with the Burnells, she sent the children a doll's house. It was so big that it had to be left in the courtyard, and there it stayed on 2 wooden boxes. No harm could come to it. It was summer, and perhaps the smell of paint would have gone off by the time it had to be taken in. For really, the smell of paint coming from that doll's house was quite enough to make anyone seriously ill, in Aunt Beryl's opinion. There stood the doll's house, a dark, oily green. Its 2 solid little chimneys, fixed to the roof, were painted red and white, and the door was yellow. 4 windows, real windows, were divided into 4 again by broad lines of green. The perfect little house. Who could possibly object to the smell? It was part of the joy, part of the newness. "Open it quickly, someone." The hook at the side was stuck. Pat opened it with his knife, and the whole house front swung back, and there you were, looking at one and the same moment into the sitting room and dining room, the kitchen and 2 bedrooms. That is the way for a house to open. Why don't all houses open like that? How much more exciting than looking through a half-open door like that? How much more exciting than looking through a half-open door into a little hall? That is, isn't it, what you want to know about a house when you come to the door? The Burnell children thought it was wonderful. They had never seen anything like it in their lives. There was wallpaper on the walls. There were pictures on the walls, painted on the paper, complete with gold frames. All the floors were red, except in the kitchen. Red chairs in the sitting room, green in the dining room. Tables, beds with real bedclothes, furniture, little plates. But what Keziah liked more than anything was the lamp. It stood in the middle of the dining room table, a beautiful yellow lamp with white glass over it. It was even filled, all ready for lighting, though of course you couldn't light it. But there was something inside that looked like oil and moved when you shook it. The father and mother dolls, who lay very stiff in the sitting room, and their 2 children asleep upstairs, were really too big for the doll's house. They didn't look as though they belonged. But the lamp was perfect. It seemed to smile at Keziah, to say, "I live here." The lamp was real. The Burnell children could hardly walk to school fast enough the next morning. "I must tell," said Isabel, "because I'm the oldest, and you 2 can join in after, but I must tell first." Isabel always gave orders, but she was always right, and Lottie and Keziah knew too well the powers that went with being oldest. They walked through the thick flowers at the edge of the road and said nothing. "And I must choose who's to come and see it first. Mother said I could." It had been arranged that while the doll's house stood in the courtyard, they could ask the girls at school, 2 at a time, to come and look. Not to stay to tea, of course, or to come wandering through the house, but just to stand quietly in the courtyard while Isabel showed them the attractions of the doll's house, and Lottie and Keziah looked pleased. But although they hurried, by the time they had reached the fence of the boys' playground, the bell had begun to ring. They only just had time to take off their hats and get into line before their names were called. Never mind. Isabel tried to look very important and whispered behind her hand to the girls near her, "I've got something to tell you at playtime." Playtime came, and Isabel was surrounded. The girls of her class nearly fought to put their arms around her, to walk away with her, to be her special friend. She received them like a queen under the great trees at the side of the playground. Laughing together, the little girls pressed close to her, and the only two who stayed outside the ring were the two who were always outside, the little Kelvies. They knew that they must not come anywhere near the Burnells. The fact was, the school the Burnell children went to was not the kind of place their parents would have chosen if there had been a choice. But it was the only school for miles, and the result was that all the children of the neighbourhood, the judges' little girls, the doctors' daughters, the shopkeepers' children, the milkmen's, were forced to mix together. There was an equal number of rough little boys as well, but some children could never become friends. There was a limit. The line was drawn at the Kelvies. Many of the children, including the Burnells, were not allowed even to speak to them. They walked past the Kelvies with their heads in the air, and as the other children always copied what the Burnells did, the Kelvies were avoided by everybody. Even the teacher had a special voice for them, and a special smile for the other children when Lil Kelvie came up to her desk with a bunch of cheap-looking flowers. They were the daughters of a hard-working little washerwoman who went from house to house. This was bad enough, but where was Mr. Kelvie? No one knew, but everybody said he was in prison. So they were the daughters of a washerwoman and a criminal. Very nice company for other people's children, and they looked it. Why Mrs. Kelvie made them wear such strange clothes was hard to understand. The truth was, they were dressed in bits, given to her by the people for whom she worked. Lil, for example, who was a fat, plain child, came to school in a dress made from a green tablecloth of the Burnells, with red arms from the Logans' curtains. Her hat, resting on top of her high forehead, was a grown-up woman's hat, once the property of Miss Lecky, the postmistress. It was turned up at the back. How silly she looked! It was impossible not to laugh. And her little sister, Else, wore a long white dress, rather like a nightdress, and a pair of little boy's boots. But whatever Else wore, she would have looked strange. She was a very small child, with short hair and big, sad eyes. Nobody had ever seen her smile. She hardly ever spoke. She went through life holding on to Lil, with a piece of Lil's dress between her fingers. Where Lil went, Else followed. In the playground, on the road going to and from school, there was Lil marching in front and Else holding on behind. Only when she wanted anything, or when she was out of breath, Else gave Lil a pull and Lil stopped. The Kelvies never failed to understand each other.